Okay, welcome back, everyone. So this is session 22, which is a plenary, and we're delighted to have Sepo, who's the Director for Strategic Partnerships, the National Research Foundation of South Africa, who's going to discuss From Principles to Actions, Open Science in Africa.
We live in a world where information and data is at the heart of our day-to-day lives. We move with very powerful tools that are able to extract information at a click of a button. The speed at which this information is transferred is unimaginable if we go back in time. Yet, despite these advancements, science information and data is not always easily accessible to the scientists and broader society. Dear colleagues, science must continue to evolve. It must become much more accessible and more accountable to the citizens and the societies. My name is Sepo Hachigonta. I work for the National Research Foundation. The role of the National Research Foundation in South Africa is to conduct research, to engage public on science issues, as well as to fund research and human capacity development. To start with, I'll just start by asking the question, what is open science? Of course, there are many definitions of open science. For example, UNESCO defines the ideology of open science as a means to allow scientific information, data, and outputs to be much more widely accessible and more reliable, and at the same time, whilst, of course, actively engaging stakeholders. Open science attempts to increase the return on investments, if we speak of a funding agency and the government perspective, by encouraging inclusivity, openness, fairness, and equity and of sharing of the data. The University of Cape Town schematic captures this well, which basically looks at the 6 pillars of open science. For instance, through open science, we can efficiently increase the sharing of our data and produce much more impactful information and research. Through open science, we can increase innovation as this reduces the delays that are associated with transferring of data. Through open science, we can increase the impact that science has on society, as this, of course, will increase the sharing of data, the sharing of the design of the research that we conduct, as well as the sharing of the information within the research process. Just a schematic, if you look at the EU, they've been quite active if you look at defining or developing policies that respond to open science. One of their initiatives, of course, is the FOSTER, which basically highlights quite a very good model of pillars aligned with open science. The whole idea that I'm sharing this schematic is not to just to look at this model and to bring it back to Africa to say this can work. If you speak of open science, you need to look at ways to develop dedicated, customized interventions that responds to the needs of the society, of the communities within a specific environment. And of course, we have to look at the enabling factors that should allow us to develop policies and to implement open science within the different communities. I'll just present a few highlights with regards to the status quo of open science in Africa, of course, looking at open access, data issues, infrastructure, as well as computing. If you go to issues around open access, of course, most academics and students are very familiar with open data and open access. Many a times you are doing research only to find that you are unable to access the publication or data that you produced as researchers or students. And in most cases, if you are able to access that data, in most cases, you find that universities and researchers, research funding agencies are spending millions of dollars to allow researchers to access that data. In Africa, of course, the practice of open science is on the rise. And if just looking at the figures, as you can see, Africa is above the global average with regards to open access publications. This, of course, might be as a result of the high publications costs that are aligned to publishing in commercial journals. National research educational networks are also a key pillar if you speak of open data and open science. The figure here basically shows a number of repositories, if you speak of gateways on data, and these are linked to the National Research Educational Networks, NRES. These are basically organizations that are specifically specialized in internet service providing, as well as other open data projects that push the agenda of open science. Most African NREs are endorsed by, of course, their respective governments, but there are some, of course, that are basically driven from the private sector perspective. Private investment as well in Africa is increasing, especially if you look at internet service providers aligned to the various IP aligned entities on data. In addition, if you look at Africa, there's also a rapid increase with regards to the connectivity. Here, the slide just shows the cable network, undersea cable network, based on the Africa Undersea Cable publication. This has been increasing significantly over the years, and this has actually made access of data much more accessible in the continent, and the broadband has increased. However, they still need to, the need to share large amounts of data aligned to research is still limited within the continent. And this impact, of course, might be aligned to the costs as well as the limited infrastructures within the continent. The figures will just show some of the high connectivity with regards to the networks and the infrastructures that the continent has. Of course, we can speak the whole day with regards to the benefits, the challenges, and the status of open science in Africa. However, the big question is, what is being done about it? Well, the good news is there's a lot of background work happening on open science. For instance, the National Research Foundation, the Department of Science and Innovation in South Africa, and the International Science Council, and many other partners in Africa are driving the African Open Science Platform. The vision of the African Open Science Platform is to put the African scientists at the cutting edge of research through open science. This platform is anchored on 6 pillars aligned to supporting data and infrastructure development, as well as increasing networking within the open science environment, whilst at the same time ensuring that the research that's being conducted is responding to the challenges that the organization has, as well as, of course, the continent has. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I will just highlight some of the key issues that I've highlighted above. Of course, the first one would speak to the need for data integration in response to the many challenges that the continent has. This, a good example is if you look at COVID-19, which has shown that if you have such a huge current health challenge, it's not only affecting the health, but it's also affecting other socio-economic components. Thus, the need of these integrated data platforms that are accessible is very, very key. Secondly, the need to make access of data and information much more widely, broadly within the science and the society fraternity is key. We need to promote or develop alternative publishing models, and this will need to adapt as well, adopt other ways that we can build on the existing platforms, as well as look at other ideas that we can build on. Infrastructure is always a big issue. If you look at the continent, we have to improve the infrastructure that we have, or we need to look at resources to develop new infrastructure in the continent as we transition our researchers or our research system towards this culture of openness. We can't do this, of course, without political support. We need to ensure that we have buy-in from different stakeholders, including politicians, the industry, and as well as develop new policies that are implementable in order to drive the open science agenda. Of course, it's not just developing new policies on open science, but the alignment of science and technology innovation policies to be much more cognizant of open science. Resources as well is a key issue. We need to ensure that we fund open science, we enable open science to become a reality. Open science doesn't mean it's free, it's not cheap, of course, but we need to allocate resources in order to successfully implement the policies and other strategies. Of course, this needs much more collective efforts between different stakeholders. We also need to be cognizant that different nations are developing or are developing a number of national policies aligned to broadly data. We need to ensure that whatever we develop on open science, whatever policies we develop on open science are aligned with national policies on data. I thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to any comments that you might have. Thank you, colleagues.
Thanks, Sepo. I appreciate you providing that Pan-African perspective, not just the South African one. But one of the key issues that was discussed at length throughout yesterday was in relation to the availability of open data sets, particularly in an African context, looking at African genomes and different things like that, and then the multiplicity of applications for machine learning and AI and its implications of making sure that we have representative data. So it's clear what the role is of policymakers and funding agencies, but I think it's also important to note the key role that research has to have to play in terms of driving successful adoption of open science. So I'd appreciate if you could comment on those issues.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for inviting me to this excellent opportunity. It's an honor to be here, and I've been listening in to so many excellent presentations. That's a loaded question. I might not have all the answers, but as you're aware, as I was speaking earlier on, if you look at challenges, for instance, of data sharing, just with COVID, even before we speak of COVID, we had Ebola a few years ago in Africa, where the challenge was most of the data that was collected from Ebola was going outside the continent. There was no repository in the continent to collect that data. And we ended up, from the African perspective, of course, there's collaborations with researchers, but at the end of that pandemic that happened, there was definitely zero data that was collected in the continent. So those are some of the dynamics, and it's not just speaking of data. Of course, we're speaking of where does that data, who houses it? Is it within infrastructure that's easily accessible within the continent? Of course, now we're speaking of cloud computing. That's the first one, the infrastructure component of it. Secondly, we're looking at the willingness as well of the researchers within the context of the continent and broadly outside, with regards to putting this data in repositories that can be easily be accessible within the continent broadly and within the various stakeholders within the national systems and the continent. And of course, aligned to that, we're speaking of the money issues. If there is no incentives tied to this openness, how does the whole model how do we start writing the whole model of openness based on incentives and other activities, but with the view of changing the culture at different levels? So that's the culture from the scientist perspective, researcher's perspective, the culture of openness from the policy perspective, from the funder's perspective, and connecting all these dots. So that's the challenge we have, and that's what the African Open Science Platform is trying to figure out as I speak now, where we're trying to work with all these different stakeholders, from universities to the African Union and all the funders in the continent and outside the International Science Council. So how do we come up with a platform which is implementable, which is will be driving all these challenges that we have on data, on publications, on policies, analyzing the policies, etc. Thanks.
Thanks, Sepo. I think it would also be useful if you could comment a little bit more on the open door registered repositories that you mentioned, and specifically how you believe other African member states can be encouraged to support the adoption of national open access repositories. You know, because there's been a lot of talk, whether it's Plan S or otherwise, in terms of almost negative incentives for people to fulfill their open science requirements, whether it's depositing papers or whether it's sharing data sets. But I think we also need to look at positive incentives as well.
Yes, definitely. At the moment, not just in Africa, not just with respect to different movements, there's a lot of talk and a lot of progress that's happening within the open science environment. The last 4 days, of course, UNESCO has been developing the recommendations for open science, and that speaks to the global response on recommendations on open science. So there's quite a lot happening at the moment. If you come down to Africa, and before I even speak of Africa, if you come down to a national perspective, a number of countries don't yet have holistic open science policies, including South Africa. Of course, we've got a policy on science, technology, and innovation. If you look at the different policies, most policies are still at an institutional level. So if you speak of, for instance, universities, if you speak of open access, universities have a number of policies that speak of open access or open data at a university level. Not all of them, a few of them have those. At the national level, very few directly respond to issues around open science holistically as a package. Of course, at national level, there are policies like in South Africa that speak of data, because data is a big thing. If you look at, for instance, we've got the PA Act that was recently a commission that looks at protection of data, basically, and that goes beyond the research. So there are those high-level data sharing policies or data policies, but they are not all aligned. If you speak of the science perspective, for instance, if you speak at what universities are doing, it's not aligned with what most national systems are doing. It's not aligned to this Africa agenda that we're speaking of. So I think that's the main key now, that how do we start aligning all these pieces? And how do we ensure that at the center of it, we put in science as a public good? Whatever comes of that, out of that public good is, for instance, if it's better, we create that culture of starting to share amongst our researchers. It's easily said and done, but that's why we're speaking of these incentives. Of course, incentives, you're speaking of money. Incentives is not always money. It can be incentives in terms of other mobility or other indicators or provisions that the funders might put in good place. But it still ties down to the effectiveness of national systems. So if you speak at the continent, who's responsible in a nutshell for implementing science, technology, innovation policies within the country, and how do the different universities or research performing entities align to that mandate of the national system of innovation and perspective in response to them conducting or being able to share data, have these incentives that the researchers are able to access. And of course, at a national level, you can't do it alone. That's where, as countries, we need as well to collectively speak as one voice from the continent's perspective, as of course, at the global perspectives, on our vision of open science and where we want the whole, we start speaking of the implementation phase of open science holistically, and of course, not just speaking at it from the public perspective, engaging, for instance, if you speak of open access, the private sector, if you look at private journals, we need to speak with them. They're big players, but we need to speak to them on how do we come up with these open science platforms that make it much more easier to share data, to share information, to share publications within the science systems.
Yeah, I think one of the key challenges that we all need to work better at is reducing silos. There's so much fragmentation, even at national level, because unfortunately, the way that a lot of funding resources is done is around competition. You know, if I take one thing I like that Science Foundation Ireland does, is that when they put together funding for centres of excellence, it's only possible to apply if you take a multi-institutional approach. You know, so the idea being that you bring together the best experts from a multiplicity of different complementary institutions, and you provide them with a positive incentive to work together. And that again would help break down these silos of what happens at the moment is, well, my institution will look better if we have these contributions, and you know, we're competing with you for funding or whatever it might be. And I appreciate from a policy point of view, that's a difficult challenge to manage, because you need to reward excellence, but at the same time, you need to incentivize collaboration.
Definitely, that's a big one, and of course there's no right way of doing it, but it all speaks of what we're trying to achieve at the end of the day. From the national perspectives, there's a big drive towards research for impact. Whatever research is being conducted, how do we ensure that the majority of it has impact on society, on policies, on the broader economy, etc. So if you want to address that, then you have to look at what you find with the lens of these global challenges, like SDG kind of lens, where you're looking at that's a challenge. How do we address that challenge? That's that mission-oriented challenge, which requires all these multidisciplinary approaches. And of course, which is, at the end of the day, it requires lots of collaborations within the system. It's not just from a funding perspective, but if you look at even how the universities are set up, they're so siloed because that's the traditional way. So how do you start breaking all those traditional ways of functioning from the university perspective? Yes, you can have departments that come up with these programs that encourage collaboration within the universities. Even the teaching itself, that the way the universities teach, it has to start now responding to these global kind of things. Of course, that doesn't mean that we should stop doing or funding or conducting research in science. Research in chemistry, research in physics, basic research is still much more needed as well. As well, looking at the long term of that, what comes out of that research in the long term, and the impacts that that research has beyond that certain siloed field is always good to conceptualize from the researcher perspective. Yes, you might be looking at chemistry, you might be looking at physics, atoms, but just having that long overview over time, where do you see your research having an impact? And just, you know, thinking around it as you're doing proposals, thinking around it as you're doing the publications with regard to that lens of impact and lens of how do you make your research open, and then the lens of collaboration, of course. So yes, you might be an expert in a certain field, but how do you learn from what other sectors are doing, and how do you position your research to have impact beyond that team that you're comfortable with? Probably that speaks to the national or global challenges that we're speaking of as now. And as I speak, if you look at South Africa as well, we're still battling this same challenge of research for impact. You know, how do you start redirecting the whole system to start rethinking how we do things? It's not easy. It's being discussed everywhere in the world. But I think once we start having these common dialogues and discussions and being on the same page, not just from the policy, not from the policy perspective, but also from the research perspective, I think these dialogues are very important to start, you know, sharing ideas, and not just ideas, not just developing policies, but going down the bottom to say, how do we actually implement this? If we're speaking of open access, how do we actually start implementing it? We know there's lots, it's at the end of the day, if you look at the private sector, it's business, they have to make money. You publish, you pay for publications. But how do we come up with our own systems, even working with the private sector, that support open science or open access, where it's a win-win situation for the private sector, public sector, and for the research fraternity at the end of the day?
No,
Thanks.
thank you very much. I'm going to pass over to Lightning that has a question, but just briefly, I think it's also an interesting challenge for funding sources, for funding agencies, in terms of balancing directed research. In other words, we're looking for research addressing specific societal challenges and doing that in a framework that allows enough flexibility for people to be creative and to encourage them to look at it from an interdisciplinary and a multidisciplinary perspective. And I think that was one of the things that came out from one of the earlier presentations today that was looking at activity research from a psychological perspective, you know, incorporating a social sciences dimension into how we look at how technology addresses society is something that's incredibly important going forward and will have implications for how we look at open science in terms of outcomes. So, Lightning, can I pass over to you for your question or your comment?
Right. So just to mention that I'm not sure if this was discussed yesterday. I missed most of the sessions yesterday, but I was just curious to find out if South Africa has some national platform that is used to aggregate, say, is it open data from what you're terming or classifying as silos. I think you have something similar that is aimed at collecting electronic theses and dissertations from around the different universities in South Africa. I was just curious if there's a similar platform that is dedicated to open data, essentially. And then I also wanted to find out if there's anyone currently attending this session who knows if there's a continent-wide initiative that is aimed at doing something similar at the continent level. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I'll start with your last one. So the Continent Initiative, this is the African Open Science platform that I'm presenting now. So this is a position not from the South African perspective. This is an African initiative. So as part of this initiative, there's legs to it. There's legs aligned to open data. There's legs aligned to infrastructure, open access, open evaluations, open policies. So at the end of the day, if you look at the African Open Science Initiative, that's what we're trying to achieve. That's the goal at the end of the day, where we're able to collect all this information and have infrastructure, where we are able to put this information available for the public, for the researchers, and even beyond to access this information and use the information and data for the research or other initiatives that might be useful. So that's the whole instance of the African Open Science Platform. With regards to timelines, of course, it's not a new initiative. It was initiated the first pilot phase from 2017 up to 2020. And then now we're in the actual implementation phase of the African Open Science as of 2020. So in that phase of getting the resources, getting buy-in from different stakeholders, including the African Union. We've got very good support from the International Science Council and the different partners in the continent that are already working on open data, open access, open evaluation. Just bring that lens to say, how do we now work collectively together, looking at, of course, the value propositions from the different entities and coming up with that, not centralized per se, but with those databases, there might be many that are accessible, and we push for the agendas. We're making the awareness agenda where researchers know these key platforms from a continent perspective that can be used to drive the agenda of open science. Within South Africa, at the moment, we don't yet have that one repository that collects all these EPC. It's always decentralized. It's within the different universities. There's more databases. Some of it is not 100% open, that are housed by the Department of Higher Education here in South Africa. But again, that's part of the agenda. If you look at South Africa as well, we don't yet have that open science policy. So there's these discussions that are happening at national level as well with regards to developing open science policy and strategy, and within these issues of collective data repositories will be part of the discussions and part of the outcomes that come out of the discussions that are happening now. So at the moment, in a nutshell, to the earlier questions, we are still far with regards to getting there. But the good thing is there's a lot of activities happening in the continent. There's lots of initiatives within different universities, and there's a will from government perspective, from institutional perspectives, from funders' perspective, even at a global level, where you look at UNESCO position in open science at that high level to say, we need to move from just talking, from just developing framework documents, to actually acting on open science.
And that's why discussions like this and a platform like IST-Africa and its Pan-African reach is so important to complement what people are doing at national level. Are there any other questions or comments before we close today's plenary? In which case, Sepo, I'd like to thank you very much for the engagement. I think we'd all agree that you described something that's incredibly important and strategically relevant, and we're looking forward to ongoing collaboration, and hopefully we can have an even more detailed discussion, including sharing insights from other African member states when IST-Africa is hosted in Pretoria next year.
Thanks a lot. It's been an honor to be here and looking forward to just having comments. Let's keep in touch. Let's keep on talking. And we're looking forward to working with all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sepo. It was a pleasure.
So now you'll have a short break. And then at 13:25 South African time, we have a presentation from Director Maria Cristina Russo, who's the Director for Global Approach and International Cooperation in Research and Innovation of DG Research and Innovation of the European Commission. So we hope you have a good break, and we look forward to seeing you at 1:25. Thank you very much.